Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 7th annual Wintergreen Land Art BioBlitz. My name is Rosie, and I'm the coordinator of the BioBlitz this year. You have arrived at the session called Conserve the Buzz, which hopefully you can see here on your screen. And I will be your host for today. So, as you can see on this slide here, we are happy to welcome Sarah MacKell from Wildlife Preservation Canada. She is a lead biologist in the Native Pollinator Initiative, which also includes the Bumblebee Watch recovery program. She has a master's degree in native bee conservation and has worked with many types of native bees in Southern Ontario. So she has generously agreed to share her knowledge with us today. So without further ado, we will be passing on our screen and the stage to Sarah. Sarah, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm good to go. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah MacKell, and I'm the lead biologist for the Native Pollinator Initiative at Wildlife Preservation Canada. Today, my talk is called Conserving the Buzz, and it'll be focusing on community science and different ways that you can also help the bees. So first, I just wanted to start off with a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to take a moment to make this land acknowledgement. Since this program is being held virtually, a singular land acknowledgement does not capture all of our locations, obviously. I will share the Guelph region acknowledgement, since this is where Wildlife Preservation Canada is headquartered, and I invite everyone to consider their own position with regards to the land on which they find themselves. So Guelph, Ontario is situated on the homelands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Attawandaron peoples, and on the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. However, our teams work across Turtle Island, and we recognize the diversity of Indigenous peoples who have and continue to steward these lands. As those involved in species conservation, our natural lands and the animals within them are so important to us. This recognition is a reflection of our commitment to listening to and cherishing the traditional knowledge that Indigenous people have of our species, and our commitment to ensuring our efforts are holistic and inclusive of all ways of knowing. So just to go over the talk outline. So first, I'm going to go into Wildlife Preservation Canada, some background on us, so who we are, and also the Native Pollinator Initiative. Then I'm going to go into some Pollinator 101, that we'll talk about bee diversity. We'll also talk about our bumblebee recovery program, specifically why do we even research bumblebees? And then we'll go into community science and Bumblebee Watch specifically, and then also some brief bee ID, so you can get a feel for what that's like, and then how to help the bees. So WPC's mission is to save animal species at risk from extinction by providing direct hands-on care. So we directly work with the animals. A lot of organizations work with habitat enhancement and things like that, but we do a lot of hands-on work with the animals and a lot of conservation breeding, which means we actually breed animals in captivity in hopes for future reintroductions. And we do this with at-risk species, so we can ensure we have thriving populations of our native species. So for bumblebees, our main focus has been the yellow-banded bumblebee, which is listed as special concern in Canada. But also in Ontario, we have the eastern loggerhead shrike, which is a really cool predatory songbird that's endangered. And there are fewer than 25 breeding pairs, and they're restricted to 2 very isolated populations. So it's really important to work on this breeding effort. And this is our longest standing program as well. And we also have the Massasauga rattlesnake in Ontario, and they're endangered as well. And they're our only rattle and our only venomous snake in Ontario, which I'm sure scares a few folks hearing about that, but they're also very important to our ecosystems. And then in British Columbia, we have a few other projects because our programs are Canada-wide. We have the Taylor checker spot butterfly, which is an endangered butterfly in Canada. We have the western painted turtle, which is endangered on this Pacific coast of Canada. And then we also have the Oregon spotted frog, which unfortunately is actually the most endangered frog in Canada. So just going into the Native Pollinator Initiative specifically, because that's what I work on the most. So our Native Pollinator Initiative, which includes our Bumblebee Recovery Program, started in 2013. And as I mentioned already on the butterfly front, we have the Taylor's checker spot butterfly, which is endangered. But thankfully, we've been having successful releases of Taylor checker spot butterflies since 2015. And since then, we've actually been able to find them on Denham Island, which we thought they were completely gone from before. So it looks like our releases are working well, which is great. And then also in Ontario, we're working with a few organizations on the recovery of the mottled dusky wing butterfly, which is endangered as well. And we'll actually be having our first releases this summer in Pine Airy Provincial Park. So fingers crossed that everything goes well there. And then, yeah, specifically, I mainly focus on the yellow-banded bumblebee, which is listed as special concern. But really, our bumblebee recovery program helps all bumblebees in general, and we get data on all bumblebees. But for our conservation breeding, for hopefully future reintroductions, has been so far really focused on the yellow-banded. So now we're going to go into some fun information on whether things are a bee or not a bee. So to be or not to be, that is the question. So just to go over some brief idea of bees, flies, and wasps, so everyone can get a handle on whether when you see an insect, if you can put it into these categories. So first, bees actually have 2 pairs of wings. Flies have 1 pair of wings, and then wasps have 2 pairs of wings, but they're very long and narrow compared to bees. Bees have long antennae with a kink, as you can kind of see here. And then flies have short antennae, which are pretty hard to see for the most part, but also most flies have really big eyes. Some bees can have big eyes, some male bees, but flies in general, it's a pretty consistent thing. And then in wasps, they have long antennae, but they can also be pretty variable. For bees, I think the most important thing that most people would think of is that they're really, really fluffy, right? So they have a lot of pollen collecting hairs, which are called scopa, and they're actually branched so the pollen grains can attach to them easier. So you see this bee here looks very fluffy, but flies don't actually have a scopa because they don't collect pollen. And wasps also don't have scopa, so they don't have pollen collecting hairs either because they don't collect pollen. So that's kind of a lot of the main differences between bees when it comes to flies and wasps is that they're actively trying to collect pollen for themselves, whereas flies and wasps kind of do passive pollination. But I just want to keep in mind that flies and wasps are great pollinators. So I know some people see them as pests, but they're very important as well. So now we're actually going to go into some polls to see if everyone can identify whether it's a bee, fly, or wasp. Oh, and sorry, I forgot to say that wasps also have long, skinny legs and a slim body with a distinct waist. And you can see how skinny its waist is in this photo here. So yeah, this takes us to our first poll. And is this a bee, fly, or wasp? Great. So I see that there's a little bit of confusion, but that's exactly why we do these quizzes. So the real answer is actually this is a fly, which I think a lot of people get really confused by because this fly is so fluffy, right? Like it looks exactly like a fluffy bee. But some identifiers for that is that they have really short antennae, which I said previously, bees have longer antennae. And also you can tell that their eyes are pretty big too. So this is what we call a bee mimic. So it tricked you, but it's trying to trick you. So it's all good. So we'll do another one. And is this a bee, fly, or wasp? Great. Yeah. So this is a wasp. Everyone that voted wasp is right. So you can see that it has a very skinny waist, a very, very thin waist, and bees are kind of more round and robust looking. It also has really skinny long legs, which is a giveaway when it comes to wasps. So we'll do a few more. So bee, fly, or wasp. So yeah, everyone that said B, you are right. So one giveaway here is the pollen collecting hairs on its underside. And you can actually see the orange that you see there is actually pollen. So it kind of tried to give you a hint that it's already collecting pollen, which is a giveaway that it is a bee. So the main thing here is how fluffy it is, and that there's also clear pollen that seems to be packed right under its belly. And we'll do another bee, fly, or wasp. Yes, it's a little split here, but the majority of people got it right. So it is a fly. One of the giveaways here is that it has one pair of wings, whereas bees have two sets of wings. So that's one of the giveaways. And then it also has those really big fly eyes as well. And it's a little harder to tell here, but it's also not as fluffy as you would expect most bees to be. And these are actually called hover flies. And you'll see them around flowers all the time. And they have very different behaviors than bees as well. But that's something that once you start looking at flowers more, you'll kind of notice throughout time. Bee, fly, or wasp? Yeah, so this is a hard one, but majority of people got it right again. So it is a bee. And you can tell mainly from its pollen collecting hairs. So many long hairs, especially on its legs, which is usually a giveaway. And yeah, this one's a tricky one. So most people don't think bees can be green. So many bees are green. It's actually really, really normal. These are common species, and usually I think when people see them on flowers, they probably think they're a fly because green is definitely associated with flies. Yeah, this is a lovely bee. You can also tell that it's not a wasp because it doesn't have that really skinny waist. It's what I would call a bee shape, which might not mean much to most people, but over time. And then we'll do another bee, fly, or wasp. This is a tricky one, so be kind to yourself if you're not sure. That is the answer I expected, but unfortunately the wrong answer. I know it's going to shock most people, but this is a bee, which is really hard. And I completely understand why most people didn't get it, especially because there aren't really any clear identifiers in this bee that it's a bee. I mean, you could kind of say that the antennae are kinked a bit, but that's not the most obvious in this photo because antennae are kind of straight. So this is actually a parasitic bee. And I don't know if most people know parasitic bees exist, but parasitic bees actually take resources from other bees. They collect their own nectar, but they actually don't collect their own pollen. So you see this bee is like really shiny and not very fluffy compared to the bees that you expect, because it doesn't actually have to collect its own pollen. It just goes about its day collecting nectar and taking pollen from other bees. So this one's really hard. And parasitic bees are kind of the bees that you just need to get to know over time to actually know that they're a bee. There's no real clear identifier when you see them. I didn't know that these were bees when I started out. And it's actually really interesting because these bees specifically, these are called nomada, which are a parasitic genus of bees. And these are one of the most common parasites of bees that we have. One of the most common parasitic bees, sorry. So if you spot these, they're usually red and yellow. So these are, yeah, these are bees, surprise. And then we'll do another bee, fly, or wasp. Yeah, so another tricky one. So this is a fly. And it's kind of similar to the bee mimic that we had previously, but you can tell that they have really big eyes. It's kind of hard to tell that it only has one set of wings in this, but it's really the big eyes. Also, really small antennae. You can't really see them. They're really small and feathered. So that's another giveaway.
You tricked us again, Sarah.
Yes, I do that. And then another one, uh, bee, fly, or wasp. Yeah, so the majority of people are right. It is a wasp. So 46% isn't the highest percentage of majority, but it is still a majority. And you can tell it has like long, slender legs. It doesn't have much fluff on it. So it's likely not a bee. Um, and it's definitely more slender than even a fly leg would be. And then another giveaway is something that I haven't touched on yet because it's not always relevant, but a lot of wasps will have their antennae like really close to the bottom of their face, whereas bees kind of have their antennae more in the middle to the top of their face. So that's kind of a giveaway when a researcher is looking at a potential wasp. That's kind of the first things that we look at. So yes, this is a wasp. And then we'll do a last one. Hopefully this one's a little easier on everyone. Is this a bee, fly, or wasp? Yeah, so 95% of people got it right. It is a bee, and you can mainly tell by its really, really long pollen collecting hairs on its legs. But overall, it's very, very fluffy. I can see why some people might think it's a fly. It's, their antennae look a little small in this photo, but I think it's just the angle we're looking at her. And her eyes aren't quite as big as what you would expect for a fly. So this is a female bumblebee. So have another poll for you. So these are all pictures of bees, actually, just to give you an example of the diversity of bees. So we're going to set up a poll now, and I want you to guess how many bee species there are in the world and also how many bee species there are in Canada. Yeah, so most people actually know the answer. I see 50% of people said there are 20,000 bee species in the world, which is true. And 39% said there are 800 bee species in Canada. So it looks like we're on the right track. People understand that there's a huge diversity of bees. Um, and there are also 400 species in Ontario and 4,000 in North America. So we have a huge diversity all over the world and also in our own backyard. So it's always really exciting to discover that. And also, most native bees are actually solitary. So 77% of bees are solitary. When most people think about bees, they're thinking about honeybees or bumblebees that live with hundreds or thousands of workers when it comes to honeybees. But most native bees actually just live by themselves, which I think is really different than what most people initially think. And there are many bees that are solitary. For example, mining bees, mason bees, leafcutter bees, digger bees, and the list goes on and on. And also a fun fact is that there are actually more parasitic bees than social bees. And I think a lot of people might not have realized that parasitic bees existed until maybe a few minutes ago. But actually, being a parasite as a bee is more common than being social. So that's another fun fact. And these bees, parasitic bees, actually take over nests, and that's where they find their pollen resource. And sometimes they even take over the nest workers as well. So it depends on what bee, but they're really interesting and also very important. So just to go into some more diversity of bees. So an example of some diversity is actually nesting structure diversity. So as I said, a lot of bees are solitary. And here's an example of a leaf cutter bee, and you can tell why it has its name. It's obviously cutting a leaf. And the picture next to it has the leaves that are being used to line her cells that she puts her eggs in. And then also on the right is a picture of flower petals being used as nesting structures. So that's really beautiful to us and also I'm sure valuable to them. So sometimes bee diversity can be beautiful that way and not just the bees themselves. And then a lot of solitary bees actually live in the ground. So here's a picture of a cellophane bee just popping her little head out, which is adorable. And then here's all these different types of nests that they can make underground. So it depends on the species, it depends on where they're nesting, so many different factors, but there could be one egg, there could be many eggs, and there also could be so many different tunnel formations as well. So here's just like a few quick examples of the diversity in bees. And here we go. Here's a bunch of our common bees that you can find. For example, here's a sweat bee. So that's one of the bees that we saw earlier that stumped a few people. So they're usually all the way green. Their whole body is green, but this bee specifically here is half green. But there are tons of different bees, and a cuckoo bee, as we mentioned previously, is also called a parasitic bee. So cuckoo bee is another word for that. But now we'll go into bumblebees specifically. So there are actually 46 species of bumblebees in North America, and they differ by many things. For example, color, as you can see here, size, and also tongue length. And tongue length is important for the types of flowers that they can actually visit to get nectar. And bumblebees have annual colonies. So this is a little different than your honeybees, because honeybees, their queens can live for multiple years, and their workers also survive through the winter. In Canada, that's due to us helping them and creating a warmer environment in a house, in a hive. But in bumblebees, they don't have this situation. So the queen that actually starts the year dies by the end of the year, and her workers also don't survive past 1 year. So it's an annual colony life cycle. So I'll just go through the life cycle a little briefly here. So in the spring, a queen emerges from where she overwintered, and then she starts making a nest. She tries to find a really good space to make a nest and to have her workers. So this can be underground, this can be above ground, it depends on the species. And then in the early summer, she starts laying eggs and having more workers appear. And then these workers help her produce more workers because they go out and get resources for her, and they help her nurse and protect her nest. And then in the late summer and fall, she has many, many workers. And then she actually starts creating, she chooses, it's really interesting, bumblebees choose to make males at this point. So there are only female bees up to this point, and now she starts making males. And she also makes new queens, which we call gynes. So these new queens are the ones that will go into next year, whereas she passes at this point, and this new queen that's mated will actually hibernate over winter. And then she'll start the whole cycle over again. So it is an annual colony. So now we'll go into our bumblebee recovery program. So what do we actually do to help bumblebees? So one of the things we do is community science. So we train people on how to identify bees and their ecology. We train people how to survey bees. So for example, netting them and putting in vials, and also taking pictures of bees. And we help them also ID in the field, for example, using our ID cards that we create. We also do a lot of education and outreach, for example, what I'm doing here today. And we do a lot of research and monitoring. This is mainly our bread and butter, this and our conservation breeding. As you can see, our technician on the right, Tiffany, she has extended her net very, very far to go get those bumblebees at the top of a tree. So we're literally extending ourselves in the field to make sure that we collect our bumblebees. And we do this so we can see where bumblebees are living, how many bumblebees are living in different areas. And we're mainly collecting queens because queens are the ones that start the colonies. So they're a good indicator of populations. So we're collecting them in the early spring because that's when queens are out and starting to get out of they're overwintering and start looking for nests and things like that. And here's a video just to show you how many bees we can actually collect in a survey at a site if we find a really good bee site. You can tell they're a little loud too. Bees are always buzzing. And yeah, as I mentioned, we also have our conservation breeding program. So our main goal for the bumblebee recovery program is actually to breed at-risk bumblebees for future reintroductions. So here's an example of a yellow-banded colony that we bred in captivity a few years back. And the big one, kind of in the middle top, is the queen. She's much, much bigger than the workers you can see around her. And it's really interesting to see up close exactly what their nesting structures look like, because I don't think many people get to see that in their day-to-day lives, but it's pretty cool and they're pretty adorable. So we're very lucky. So why do we research bumblebees? First off, they're actually globally threatened, which is really unfortunate. About 30% of bumblebees in the world are at risk of extinction. And in North America, about 26% of bees are at risk. So this can go from vulnerable to critically endangered, which is just different categories of, how at risk they are of becoming extinct. But there are many, many reasons why potentially we see these declines in bumblebees. It's really, really hard to pick one exact reason because there's so many different things going on. For example, one of the reasons is habitat loss, and this can be due to increasing lands for agricultural production and also building buildings and creating urban developments. Another is pesticides. I think this one is talked about quite a lot. It's been shown that pesticides have pretty bad impacts on bees in general. And another one that I think is kind of overlooked in a lot of situations is actually pathogens and diseases that come from managed bees. So managed bees could be bumblebees in greenhouse settings, or it could be actually honeybees in their hives, as you see here in this box picture. So this is a big issue because we bring managed bees into areas that they usually wouldn't be, especially honeybees. Honeybees are not native to Canada and North America. So they have diseases that our bees aren't used to here. So it could really have negative impacts on our native bees. And also honeybees can live with up to 60,000 workers. So you can imagine introducing that many bees into an ecosystem. If they have a disease, they can spread it pretty quickly, unfortunately. So really trying to get a hold of our disease and pathogen management with our managed bees is really, really important for conserving our native bees, for example, bumblebees. And finally, climate change is really a big threat as well. It can change where our bees can live because it can change the temperature and rainfall, and also extreme weather events. If there are big weather events that could really drastically decrease a population. So these are all different things going on, and it's really hard to pinpoint one of them, but they all likely are causing our bee declines. And here are a list of our at-risk bumblebees in Canada. We have our rusty-patched bumblebee, which is endangered. We have our western bumblebee. We have our yellow-banded, which I've mentioned quite a few times now that we focus on, that's special concern. We have our American, our gypsy cuckoo, and our Suckley's cuckoo. So those are both parasitic bees that are one's in danger and one's threatened. Bumblebees are also excellent pollinators. So they're generalist foragers, which means that they can go to many, many different types of flowers. So this is great because they can pollinate a lot of our crops and wildflowers. And they're also early and late foragers, which is really important because they're so big and fluffy, they're actually able to be out in colder temperatures than most bees. So they can be out in the early mornings or late evenings, and they also can be out in the early spring and also the early fall. So they can be out in those colder temperatures that other bees might not be able to be out at. So it's really important for those plants that need pollination at those times. They're also native, so they've co-evolved alongside our native plant fauna, which means that they've evolved techniques to make them really, really good pollinators. And they're also just huge, and they're really fluffy, as I mentioned, which really helps with passive pollen spread because they just accidentally get a lot of pollen on them sometimes, and they don't always pack it really tightly in their legs. So that pollen is transferred from plant to plant pretty easily for them. So I'm sure some of you have also heard of that bumblebees can do buzz pollination. And buzz pollination are actually just bees holding onto a flower and vibrating really hard. And this shakes the pollen off of the anthers of the flower. And some flowers really like to keep hold of their pollen. So sometimes the shake is just what they need. So these pollinators can take that pollen from flower to flower. And certain flowers, for example, tomatoes, really need this buzz pollination that bumblebees are able to do. So here's some videos of bees doing that buzz pollination. Hopefully you can hear how loud she is. There we go. So those are some reasons. And another one is that they're actually really economically valuable. So global pollination services amount to about several billion USD per year. And as I mentioned previously, bumblebees are actually used for pollination services as well. They can be managed bees. So we usually put them in greenhouse settings. And as you can see here, in a tomato greenhouse. Also, about 1 in 3 mouthfuls of our food require animal pollination to an extent, which includes bumblebees. And about 90% of flowering plants in general are pollinated by animals, including bumblebees. They're also ideal candidates for community science. So a lot of bees are actually really, really small. Some bees can be just half a millimeter big. So bumblebees are actually really large compared to the average bee. So it helps us be able to see them through pictures and also just visually when we're out in the field looking for them. So this helps get community science members involved and interested because they can actually learn to identify them on the spot. They don't need things like microscopes or like any really in-depth academic training to at least identify your most common species because they have these really lovely different color patterns that you can easily pick up on, and things like ID cards, as you see here, can help people identify the most common bees. So why do we do community science? Community science is really important to research and conservation programs. Most researchers are very limited by time, personnel availability, and funding. We just can't be everywhere at once. So getting people to do observations from their own backyard or their own neighborhoods is really helpful for us. And it can also increase search effort and site-specific data. So that means if there's an area we know at-risk bees are, it's great to set up a program where people are looking for them constantly, where we might not have the time to do that. They're also really engaging programs, and they make people connect with nature in a way they might not have before. So here's an example of a blog someone wrote before about our community science programs, about how it really opened them up to the world of bees and also nature. So our main community science program, Wildlife Preservation's community science program, is at Pine Area Provincial Park, which started in 2015. And this is actually the last place that the rusty patch bumblebee was found in 2009, unfortunately. And also the last place the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee was found. So this is an important place that we want to keep searching. And then there's also other bumblebee community science programs that we helped start. For example, Science North and Alderville Black Oak Savanna. And they continue to look for bees on their property and in their general area. So with our Ontario programs, we've already found 12 species, which is pretty good. And we also found 4 rare and at-risk species. For example, we found the American bumblebee and the yellow-banded bumblebee in a few years. And for rare bees, we found the lemon cuckoo bumblebee and the yellow bumblebee in a few years as well. So it's helping find those bees you might not be able to find in other areas. So how do we do this? We actually do this through Bumblebee Watch. Bumblebee Watch is a North American-wide bumblebee community science database. So this is a little different than things like iNaturalist. It's very specific to bumblebees. So if you know you have a bumblebee photo, this is a great place to put it. And we'll tell you if it's not a bumblebee, so you don't have to be too worried. But you basically just submit photos of bumblebees to our website or app, and then users can identify their submissions with an identification guide, but then verified experts actually go and verify the observations. So people like myself and other bumblebee experts are the ones that say 100% it's that bee, which is kind of different than iNaturalist. It's a little bit more formal this way, whereas iNaturalist, you rely on community scientists to go and identify your bees. And it's not always clear whether they're experts in their field, whereas Bumblebee Watch, they're always experts in their field. So you can be pretty confident when you get that verified identification. Bumblebee Watch has really increased our survey coverage of bumblebees. There's been almost 78,000 observations submitted, and there have been records in every state, province, and territory in North America. And we've also verified 40 of our 46 species, which is pretty amazing. Also helps us locate rare species. There's been just over 5,000 verified records for 11 out of the 13 declining North American species. And we've also have just over 2,000 records of the 4 federally assessed at-risk bumblebee species. So that's really great to get that information. But you might be thinking, what does this data set really do? So this data set can be used for policy support and discussion. For example, managed bees. So I mentioned before that managed bees can spread pathogens and diseases. So it's really important to know if those managed bees are where they are, and also if they're actually starting populations in areas where they weren't native in the first place. So Bombus impatiens, which is the common eastern bumblebee, is native to North America, but it's not usually found out west in Canada. And you can see this gray area here is its native range. And then these red boxes is actually where we've found potential populations starting. And we've also found them mating. So the picture on the top right is a picture of them mating. So this is a sign that these populations might be actually establishing, which might not be great for our bumblebee communities in those areas. So it's really good to be able to monitor that going forward. This data is also used for species status assessments. So actually being able to tell whether bees are at risk or not. It's also used to develop better conservation strategies. For example, identifying and prioritizing sites for habitat stewardship projects, and also guiding species-specific or region-specific research and conservation programs. For example, our own programs for our surveying and conservation breeding, we often use Bumblebee Watch to figure out where should we even go to find these bees in the first place. So now we'll go into some species identification, very high level stuff, just to give you an idea of how to identify bumblebees. So how do you tell them apart? A lot of them are easy to tell by color pattern, but some of them you do need a microscope. But with the right angles, many can be identified from photos. And here are some ways you can identify them. For example, the Bumblebees of North America guide is our best guide to date on Bumblebee ID. Bumblebee Watch, which has an identification tool, and also different things like our Bumblebee ID cards that we do for specific regions. But keep in mind, males and females can look different. So Bumblebee ID isn't the simplest, but for females, you can kind of get the hang of it relatively quick. So what do you even want to look for when you look at a bee to try to identify it? First off, I just want to go through some basic anatomy of a bee. So you have their head, you have the thorax, and then you have the abdomen. And you can kind of see the abdomen has different sections to it. And we call these terga. That's what each section is called. But for shorthand, you just call it T1, T2, T3, and so on. And that's just referencing from the top to bottom what section you're talking about. So that's important because of the different color patterns they have on their abdomen. So yeah, you want to look for the color of their thorax. You want to look at the patterning on their thorax, which you can see here is this like gray, black kind of teardrop shape here that you would want to notice. The color of the face, in this diagram, you can see that it has a little colored in black at the top. Abdominal banding, so T1 to T6, or T7, because males actually have longer abdomens, so they have one extra section. And you also want to keep in mind when you actually found this bee. So queens are usually out in the spring, workers are usually out in the late spring, summer, and then males are usually out in the late summer, fall. So that kind of helps you narrow down who you might have seen. And just to be able to see these anatomal parts just on a real bee, so you see the head, the thorax, the wings. Another important thing to bring up is actually the hind leg that you see here that has a pollen basket. So the pollen basket, as I said before, has the scopa, so those really long pollen collecting hairs, which is a great indicator that you have a female bee, because male bees actually don't collect pollen. So let's look at this picture. What do we see? We see a yellow thorax. We see a black patch on the thorax. You see the first segment is yellow, but the rest is black on their abdomen. Unfortunately, you can't really see the face color, and that happens sometimes. But you also see pollen on the hind leg, which tells you that it's a female. So this, if you're looking at ID guide, this would bring you to the common eastern bumblebee, which is the most common bumblebee that you'll find pretty much anywhere in Ontario. So as I said before, males and females are a little tricky to identify. Males are harder to identify than females. Males are often smaller than females with highly variable color patterns. Another way to tell them apart is that males are actually lankier, so they're longer. They have an extra segment on their antennae and an extra abdominal segment. And as I mentioned, males don't carry pollen, so if you see a bee with pollen, it's definitely a female. They often have mustaches, which I think is the best part about them. They often have these yellow or white hairs on their face, and we always call them mustaches. Males, as I said, also tend to be out later in the season. And males also don't have a stinger. So if anyone out there is really scared of bees, males are the kind of bees that you want to be looking for. I wouldn't encourage everyone to pick up bees that you think are males because you want to be sure. But you can see here my colleague Tiffany showing off her bee identification skills and putting male bees all over her. So once you know you have a male, they're pretty safe to interact with. So let's go through some male versus female identification practice. So another polling session, is this a male or a female? Yeah, so everyone that said female bee is right. And one way you can tell is that it has a wide hind leg, and you can see some hairs there that it would collect pollen. Another is that it doesn't have a super long abdomen. It only has those 6 terga or sections. So those are some ways. And then also you can kind of see a little sharper point at the end. So that's actually its stinger. Another, male or female? Yeah, so the majority of people are right. It is a male bee, and you can tell by its lovely mustache is always a really great indicator, all those yellow long hairs on its face. It also has pretty long antennae as well. And you might think that these are pollen collecting hairs, but they actually aren't as branched, which is kind of hard to tell. But I think the mustache and the long antennae are kind of your go-to. And I'll go through these really quick. We don't have to do the polls because we're running out of time. But this is a male bee as well. It has a long body and a pretty skinny leg that's less fluffy and long antennae. And then this is a female, and you can tell by its pollen basket. Always a giveaway, pollen, female. And also you can see her stinger as well. So I'm going to gloss over submitting to Bumblebee Watch. I think it's pretty easy to figure it out once you're actually on the app or on the website. So hopefully everyone can figure that out themselves. Sorry, we're a little short on time. But I think the best part about it is the identification tool, and it asks you things like, what was its face color? What does its thorax look like? What is the patterning on its abdomen? So things that we went through that I think you'll be able to figure out pretty quick. And on the right, it gives you some potential bees that it might be, and you can pick from that list. So just some photo tips. You want to take as many good photos as possible. For example, continuous photos or macro mode. And you can also take a video and screenshot that later, which is sometimes easier with your fast flying bees. That's pretty difficult sometimes. And most importantly, you want to be able to get different views of your bee. So it's great to get a side view, a back view, and a face view if possible. I understand that that's not always possible. Bees don't always cooperate, but that's ideally what you want, to be able to see every identifier. So an expert can give you 100%, it's that bee. And what can you do to help? So you can make pollinator habitat, which I think a lot of people talk about often. So you want to feed the bees. It's important to have a long bloom time from about May to September. You want to vary the colors, shapes, and sizes, because different bees like different flowers. And you want to make sure that those bees that might only like a certain amount of flowers actually get those resources. And you want to plant native species as well, because native bees usually like native species more than your ornamental flowers. You also want to house the bees. So I mentioned before, a lot of bees actually live underground. So having that bare soil is really important for them. You also want to leave your leaf litter, your long grass, your stems, because a lot of bees live in stems as well. So having these undisturbed patches in your garden are really important for them. And finally, as I've mentioned quite a lot, you want to really try to get involved in community science in your area. Sometimes, there might not be a program you can get involved with. There aren't too many in Ontario, but we hope to increase that. But anyone can observe bees and put them on Bumblebee Watch, and that is a huge contribution to science. And finally, I just want to say thank you to everyone. I'm sorry that I kind of had to skip through some of my slides a little bit quick, but I really encourage everyone to sign up for our newsletters through our website if you want to get more information on what we do, and if you want to get involved as well for any of our community science programs.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful. There's so much to learn for sure. We
Thank
do
you.
have some questions here in the Q&A that I would love if you have time to answer.
Yep.
So one from Declan, are paper wasps an endangered species?
That's a good question. I'm not a wasp expert by any means. Off the top of my head, I feel like I've seen a lot of paper wasps, but I don't want to give any definitive answers on that. I'm very much a bee person, unfortunately, but wasps are very interesting.
Okay, so then the next question from Hilo is, do bumblebees live alone?
Yeah, so bumblebees actually don't live alone. As we went through the colony life cycle, I hope you would have seen that, they produce a lot of workers. So bumblebees can live with up to 50 to a few hundred bees, actually. But it is an annual life cycle, so those workers unfortunately die at the end of the summer.
Okay, the next question is, how do bees make wax?
They actually have special glands to make wax. So they basically make wax out of their abdomen, at the end of their abdomen. And I don't know the specific chemical answer to that, but they have a special gland basically.
Okay, the next question is, what colors do bees see?
So I think they see most colors. One of the colors that they don't see is red, actually. So we actually manage all of our captive bred colonies under red light, because it keeps them calm to be in darkness. And it's another reason why, if you have red flowers out, they might actually not like it too much, because they actually can't see the flowers, but they can see UV light, which is really interesting.
Aha, interesting. So they must see red as another color, I guess, then, because
I think it's like
they
black to them, basically.
oh, okay, because they do find the red flowers somehow. So
Yeah, I don't think it's most bees top choice, but depending on the plant, yeah.
okay. Another question, how many bees other than the honeybee make honey?
Yeah, so the only other bees that we know that make like a large amount of honey are actually stingless bees. And stingless bees live in the tropics. We do not have stingless bees here. They're very cool. And as you can tell by the name, they're stingless. So they're easier to manage as well, in that way at least. But bumblebees and other native bees actually don't make enough honey like substance. It's not quite the honey that you think of to have people take it. So bumblebees make what we call honey pots, but it's really just like slightly concentrated nectar. It's not what you would picture as honey from a store.
We have another question. What is a pollinator garden?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no like real definition. I think it's pretty much any garden that you know has plants that bees like. So those are usually native plants, and also most stores at this point will have a section that's native plants or pollinator friendly and things like that. So if you see a plant that has a lot of pollinators on it, that's usually a pollinator friendly plant for the most part. So you can classify a lot as a pollinator garden, I'd say.
Very cool. So there was a question about whether all bees can sting you, but I think you answered that. A lot of bees don't sting, and some, even the male bumblebees, don't have stingers. The next question is, can bees poop?
Yeah, bees do poop. Actually, as a scientist, I'm planning on looking at bee poop this summer for research, actually, because you can find pathogens and different things in their poop to show whether they're actually healthy. So bees definitely poop, and it's really important to get that information from it as well.
Great question. I love that you're going to study poop. Bee poop. You can tell all your friends that. That's
Yeah.
wonderful. Another question, how deep do bees live?
I think that's a great question. I don't think we have an exact answer to that. I would say probably a few meters max would be my answer. I don't think that most live that far down, probably within like half a meter. But it really, really depends on the species. Some species make really deep tunnels, some make really shallow ones. So it really depends.
Where questions are just keep going. It's great. So can bees be red?
Yeah, bees can be red. The one parasitic bee I showed in the bee versus fly versus wasp quiz was a nomada, and most nomada are red or yellow. So yeah, bees can be basically any color. Bees can be purple. Bees can be blue. Bees really don't follow any rules when it comes to colors.
Okay, so another question. What makes some bees parasitic? So maybe just tell us a little more about what's the difference there between the social bee and the parasitic bee.
Yeah, so actually, some parasitic bees are social, but that's fine. I don't have to go into that too much. But basically, parasitic bees take resources from other bees, and that's what makes them parasitic. But parasitic bees are really interesting because they actually have a really armored body, we would say. It's really hard compared to most bees because they invade nests. So they want to be really sturdy bees that can take a few stings and still survive. So they're actually like really hard bees that look pretty wasp-like because they aren't very fluffy. But what makes them parasitic is that they take resources from other bees.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think since we're already running over time a little bit, what we'll do is put a couple of resources that Sarah has. I believe we already did. We put some resources that Sarah has provided for us in the chat. There should be a link there, bumblebeewatch.org, as well as Wildlife Preservation Canada, um, and a way to sign up for the newsletter if you want to learn more. The links were just shared again in case you didn't see them. And I'll ask Sarah to stop sharing her screen and say thank you so much. And there are many more questions, so hopefully you'll get lots of people signing up for your newsletters. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Sarah. That was really super interesting. And I see that there's a lot more to learn. So have a lovely lunch break and take care, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.